Hi, good evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Nasher. I'm Curator of Education Anna Smith, and this evening it gives me great pleasure to introduce artist Tavares Strachan. Strachan was originally scheduled to speak in April of 2020, but for some reason or another, that one didn't work out. Who can remember why? I think it's especially fitting that he be the first artist that the Nasher has brought to Dallas for an in-person talk in almost 2 years, and I'm glad that you can all be here tonight for this special experience. Tavares Strachan explores science as an artistic medium and shines light on how knowledge and truth are actively created by society. He works in collaboration with organizations and institutions across disciplines to promote a broader and more inclusive understanding of artists, scientists, and the systems and support networks that make their work possible. Strachan received a BFA in Glass from the Rhode Island School of Design in 2003 and an MFA in Sculpture from Yale University in 2006. His work has been featured in numerous solo exhibitions, including Prospect 3 Biennial, Biennale de Lyon, the Bahamas National Pavilion at the 55th Venice Biennale, and MIT List Visual Arts Center, among others. He's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2019-2020 Artist in Residence at the Getty Research Institute, 2018 Frontier Art Prize, and the Allen Institute's inaugural Artist in Residence in 2018, 2014 LACMA Art and Technology Lab Artist Grant, 2008 Tiffany Foundation Grant, 2007 Grand Arts Residency Fellowship, and 2006 Alice B. Kimball Fellowship. In conversation with Strachan is poet, linguist, and teaching artist Alysia Nicole Harris. Harris received her PhD in linguistics from Yale University and her MFA in poetry from NYU. She has spent a decade performing nationally and internationally, including at the UN, the US embassies in Jordan and Ukraine, and the National Theater. Her first chapbook, How Much We Must Have Looked Like Stars, 2 Stars, won the 2015 New Women's Voices Prize, and she has been a Cave Canem Fellow, Pushcart nominee, and the 2014 and 2015 Stephen Dunn Poetry Prize winner. In addition to her new role as Director of Public Programs for Corsicana Artist and Writer Residency, she also serves as the Arts and Soul Editor for Scalawag magazine. I'm eager to cede the stage to our guest speakers tonight, so I'll ask you to please join me now in welcoming Tavares Strachan and Alysia Nicole Harris.
Hello, good sir.
What's up?
It's good to be here tonight. So I don't know if you know this, but we have an overlapping experience. We both went to Yale. We both have done some weird sort of experiments in Russia at various times in our lives. And I'm interested in talking to you sort of about this impulse to travel. Your work has been to explore these really extreme kind of environments and climates. And I'm curious about where the impulse to dislocate comes from.
Hello, everyone. And it's good. It's really good to be in a space with people. If we think back to just a year ago or 2 years ago, so it's just great to be sitting here. I really love your question. I've been thinking a lot about nostalgia recently. Several years ago, I had a studio visit that more or less ended studio visits for me for a while, just because I was very distraught. We artists are, as you know, a very sensitive bunch. And this critic at the time had said, well, your work is becoming very nostalgic. And I thought, okay, what does that mean? And fundamentally, as a linguist, I'm sure you're aware of this, but we don't always know what we mean when we say words.
Yeah. We have a sense, but
exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, so long story cut short, the word nostalgia comes from the collision of 2 Greek words. It was more or less invented by a physician I think around 1688, during a war, and the soldiers at war at the time were experiencing a grave longing for the homeland. And that's fascinating for me because, you know, when you're from the diaspora, like me, I'm from the Bahamas, imagine being in one place and many generations later waking up in another place, and then having someone tell you that your feelings of nostalgia don't really make sense, and that you shouldn't reflect on your history.
Yeah.
And so I think the idea of not being able to process one's own story in a public way, or even in a private way, or in a way that is validated by culture, presents a dissonance that I think is problematic, but as an artist, very fascinating. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it was good. It was very informative. I'm interested then, sort of this notion of nostalgia or longing, or maybe even exile, feeling not quite at home in a variety of different places, or trying to explore a home that is retrievable in a kind of way. And I'm interested into how like that intersects with the neon sculpture that you have here, with a phrase like "you belong here." That phrase on that sign, it seems so static, but there's a lot of fluidity, a lot of change, a lot of openness present, especially in the use of the you and the here. So I'm curious about how that openness sort of constructs itself in this piece, but also in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of sort of trying to find that kind of space of home.
Yeah. The great John Balasari has a quote, which is, artworks are really good at pointing at things that are not in the room. And so the question is, who are you and where is here?
Absolutely.
Right? And I think we all struggle with fitting in. And I think this work for me is about sameness. There's so much work done around how we're different. And so I think that the work for me is a kind of lyrical wordplay. And I think that's the case for a lot of work that has language in it. Mm-hmm. Because as you read it, you almost repeat it like a lyric from a song. And in that way, you become a part of it, and it becomes a part of you. And it's something that I think is something that I enjoy. But I also think it has a dark undertone.
Yeah.
You know, like if you really feel that way, then why you got to say it?
Right. I mean, that's something that's so striking to me. I thought this phrase could be interpreted in so many different ways depending upon the context in which you're in, right? It could be uttered in a space where it's already affirming what people already know. Of course I belong here.
Right.
Right? It could be uttered in a way that is trying to convince people to come, or welcome people, or invite people into a space who might not feel welcome. And then I also think of the you who potentially is saying it to themselves, that you belong here, the trying to convince yourself that you have the capacity to take up space. And what's interesting is that, you know, you and here are both deictic elements, so they get their meaning, their referent from context. But it's also interesting because this piece is floating on. So it's also changing in terms of the location, even as you're encountering it, which is so interesting. Yeah.
I think one of the main ingredients of being an artist is this relationship one has to being disoriented. And disorientation is a fundamental part of creative practice. I think that so much of the world's problems are resolved through allowing oneself to go through the process of being disoriented.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did you get to the neon work? We had a conversation prior, and you said that you had been slightly skeptical of neon for a while, and then you kind of began to embrace it. Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, I think my biggest problem is I'm skeptical of everything. But I think that the point of making work for me is to bring me closer to an audience. And I think that whatever materials are at my disposal become the most important and potent material. You know, I'm not one of those artists who's like, I'm a woodworker, I'm a welder. I think I'm a storyteller. And so this material became a kind of a very specific way to communicate in a way that is direct, and it allows a kind of a visual but also internal sonic way of understanding the function of language in relation to form. And you know, only this material can do that in this way. I also worked with glass for 6 years and kind of forgot about that when I was upset about working with neon.
That's so dope. Yeah, I also think the work with neon is particularly interesting because of the phrasing that comes up over and over in your exhibitions. This idea of seen and unseen, in plain sight. We'll get to it in a minute, but the encyclopedia of invisibility, and you're working with a kind of light or illumination, and that seems to be a conceptual play, but I wonder if you could talk about sort of the importance of this notion of visibility, or what we can see and what we can't see.
I think there's something that is profound about the Black experience in this particular moment, especially in the art space, when there's this perception that there's so much coverage being given to artists of color. I think that when you're from an island that's 21/7, this is the island I grew up on, the population is 350,000 people, and when you move to America and you say you want to be an artist, there's this kind of vibe about you having to get in line. If you go to the museum, there's no category for the place that I'm from at the museum. And so when you are working in the visual arts, it doesn't necessarily feel like a welcoming space for you.
Yeah.
And I think that it's significant for us to name that as a thing, right? So who's allowed to be an artist and who's deciding? And I think we all are in some way. And I think it's important for us to think through that, because I feel like the next philosopher or great thinker or the great-great-grandson of Marcus Garvey is sitting on one of those islands, and is just waiting for a shot.
Yeah. I remember as a kid being told you could never, I got my fortune in my little yearbook, something like that, and I was told, Alysia at 25 finds out poetry can't pay her bills. And I remember being like, but being told at a very young age, there's no way that you're going to be able to do what you want to do. And there was no conception for how the need there was for a person like me to do whatever I wanted to do, right? The need that existed for that. And so I remember as a kid being very affronted by that and being like, you ain't gonna be a poet, but I am. I'm curious in terms of what was that moment for you when you either encountered a material or when you said, I got an idea here, and I'm gonna walk it forward. And what were like the conditions?
As a boy, I always loved to draw, and I had this English English art teacher, so art teacher from England, in the Bahamas at the time, and she was very encouraging. And I think I was around 12 at the time, and there was a competition for the Made in the Bahamas logo. And she comes in and she's 6'4", she has a slight hump, and she says, "You know, Tavares, I think you should do this competition." And I said, okay, well, you know, but in a nonchalant 12-year-old style, and I did it, and I won the competition, and I won $1,200, a scholarship for $1,200 I was going to get later on. And reflecting back, it was the moment that changed everything for me, because no one in my neighborhood had ever given me the opportunity to think about the future. And so much of how we move humanity forward is giving folks the opportunity to consider the future.
Yeah.
And so in this moment, by the way, I went to Rhode Island School of Design. It was not $1,200. So it really wasn't about the money, right? It was about the idea, right? And I think this is the one thing that the kind of social conventions of being a human and coming up and, you know, coming of age struggles have to do with being an artist, right? Or the art world, or because there's this kind of conceptual piece and there's this physical piece, and they kind of merge. But this was the moment for me that was really helping me to understand that there's this space for you in the future, right? Right?
Yeah. Yes. I want to go there, and I'm going to. So, you know, this idea of like your work, when I think about your work, I think about the ways that is actually creating space, using space as a material for future possibilities, but also for historical redress, and the way that these past figures, who we're going to look at in a second, but these past figures become, through your work, have this kind of anaphoric relationship where, you know, you are availing them opportunities to sort of speak back into a narrative that they were excluded from, and I think that that's a way of creating space, not just in like a gallery or a museum, but actually like space in like the narrative for people to sort of slip in and interweave themselves. And so like in a piece like this, where we have I belong here, you belong here, we belong here, but then you also have the explosion of those very words. Can you talk about why both the assertion and the denial that's present here in this kind of space, and what the impact you hope to be on the viewer, sort of?
Yeah, I think I have whether it's good or not, I have a really profound belief in the audience and their ability to deal with that, manage that tension that you describe. And I think that belief is actually what gives me confidence and some faith in humanity, right? Because otherwise, why would we all be sitting here, and what would we be doing otherwise?
Yeah.
And I think it just makes me think of all of the artists that I love, early interviews of them. Because you could like, if you watch an early Jay-Z video or an interview of him, you could tell that he's moving with positive uncertainty, right?
Yeah,
And he goes on to become the guy that he is now. But 20-something years before, he wasn't allowed to go on stage to collect his Grammy, right? And that guy is now the guy that we all know as, a kind of superhero. So I think that positive uncertainty is really profound. And sometimes you're doing these things and the people in your own inner circle are like, "What? We're not going to do that. That's not going to happen." And I think that's a part of it, right? Is that like you're working your way into telling that story and presenting complexity, right?
Yeah.
The thing about the future is we don't know what it is. And no one can tell you what it is.
Yeah.
And so all these people that are giving you advice and telling you what you can and can't do,
They don't know.
they don't really know. That's the crazy thing.
Yeah. I love that word, positive uncertainty. I'm going to speak a little ahead. because you're talking about a narrative, a narrative as material. And I love this piece because it's a sculpture, it's an object, but it's also a body of knowledge. And so I guess my question is, how did this piece come about, the conception of it, and then sort of it's ongoing, it's an ongoing process?
Yeah. For me, I have this fundamental belief that we're all talking to our younger selves, right? And so I think all the artists that I love, all the poets, the architects, they're making work for their younger selves. And so in this case, I used to go to my grandma's house, and I used to read the encyclopedia. And I always thought, like, what's up with this? How do they know?
How do they know
all this? And not only how do they know all of it, who's deciding what is in it, what's not in it? And I thought to myself then, well, as soon as I get the chance, I might make my own. And I think that's one of the craziest things about being an artist is you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And I think I think you can get caught into the web of being a career artist, right? And you could forget that you could do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so this project was a reminder of that for me, right? As so many of them are. They're just all reminders that you could do whatever, you could really stretch the boundaries and think about using the work to create opportunity in space, right?
I mean, I think there's a kind of audacity with a project like this. I mean, you just said, I can create whatever I want, I can do whatever I want, and then you think about the actual people who are creating encyclopedias and the question about, like, well, what are the constraints for what goes into an encyclopedia and what doesn't make it in there? And I guess my question is, going on, 15,000?
17,000. More than that now, but yes.
17,000 entries. How do you decide what goes into it? Like, what's that process?
Yeah, I think this is something that I like to say to younger folks, which is that people are all making it up, man. And I think that all the stories that I was interested in as a child that weren't really told in any way that was enlightening or reflected the folks that I was going to school with or seeing in my neighborhood, I thought they needed a place to be. And so if the encyclopedia represented visibility, then I wanted to try to represent invisibility. Mm-hmm. And what does invisibility look like? And it goes back again to this idea of the future, like we don't really know, right? So we're making it up. And I think this is, like in the moment of chaos that we're in as civilization, I think this is the kind of power of art, right? We're occupying that space where we're trying to negotiate the future, right? By talking to the past.
But it's a liminal space. It's a space of, uncertainty and questioning what you know and questioning what you don't know, and then the criteria for coming to those conclusions, which, is something that strikes me about this work, is to really begin to analyze as an object itself these bodies of knowledge that we have created. And I think, science is one of the ways that we're sort of advancing this project of human knowledge. And I think that art is another way that you advance that work of human knowledge, but you're sort of looking at science with a kind of skepticism and exploiting the nooks and crannies. And I guess I'm saying it's a space of uncertainty. And how do you navigate that? Or how do you, like when I'm thinking of this installation, the amount of knowledge is overwhelming. It's how do you know when to stop? You don't. I mean, I think you don't. I think
So for this work is called 1890. And the reason why it's called 1890 is because there was this kind of enlightenment for inventors in 1890. This is right on the edge of abolition. And so there's all this pent up creative energy. And this is the year where there was the most patents submitted to the patent office in the history of the world, even up to today. In addition to that, the majority of the patents that were submitted were of black folks, which is crazy. And I think
how do you find this information? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. And so what's fascinating about this work, and so you're saying recreations of some of those inventions, mixed in with some of the text from the encyclopedia as a kind of, assemblage, collage, painting, but that becomes a room as a kind of background, a backdrop for, again, a story about invisibility. But I think it's profound because information has the ability to change reality, right? So if you give someone information, if you say to a kid, oh, by the way, you come from a long line of scientists, in a community where someone might be telling that kid, well, you can't be a scientist, that information fundamentally, again, this is my argument for why art in this moment, right? Why art is profoundly significant and important in this moment, because I think that information, it changes all of us, right?
yeah. It's that point that you made about the majority of the patents being submitted were from black folks reminds me of this idea. I was talking with it and my mom, we were discussing your work on the way up here, and the idea that for such a long time, black folks could be objects of study. It could be analyzed, experimented on, manipulated for external purposes to our own benefit, but we couldn't actually be bodies of knowledge. We couldn't, our literal bodies could not produce knowledge that could be useful to either to the wider world, and that sort of that mechanism of redress in your work is to question that and to actually put black observers, black artists, black inventors, black scientists into the position that they have always been able to hold as observers of the world, of people who are able to analyze and to communicate that and give that contribution meaning and weight is also really powerful in this moment. And to be able to say to that kid, yeah, that's you right there, could be you.
I mean, I think I was in early college when I had eczema, and one of the things the doctor prescribed was cortisone, and cortisone was discovered by a black man, right? And this I'm using it now still, but this is profound, right? And I think knowing this is important, and I think it's this kind of cat and mouse game of not necessarily about invisibility, but what's visible and why it's visible, because usually it's taking the space of something that is not there, right? So the things we know are also, why are we knowing the things that we know? It makes me think about school curriculums, and it's just how power is constructed, right?
Yeah. Got you. I'm going to come back to these, but I wanted to talk about power in this image. Every knee shall bow. So what's the deal with the title of this piece? And
So the reason, one of the biggest inspirations for the Encyclopedia Project and a lot of the work that I make is the fact that when I was in school in the Bahamas as a kid, you actually never learned about anyone black. I know more about Columbus and the conquistadors than I know about anyone from Nairobi or Ethiopia or the Sudan. And but there was this kind of diamond in the rough, which was music, right? And music was a space where, all of the older folks in the community were skeptical of it, specifically reggae music, because it was seen as rebel music. But in the music were all these kind of hidden gems about history and all these untold stories. So I would go to school and I would learn what they were teaching me, and then I would go home, and then like the drug dealer across the street would be playing reggae. And in that music that was kind of shrouded in this kind of the chaos of the neighborhood was information about Haile Selassie or Marcus Garvey or Prince Emmanuel or the Nile or civilization or the invention of mathematics or architecture, and all this is embedded in the lyrics of the music, which is really my real education, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so emperors outrank kings and queens, and so this Ethiopian man His Majesty Haile Selassie met up with Queen Elizabeth, and because emperors outrank queens, she had to bow to Haile Selassie, and I think he's the only emperor the only person that she's ever had to take the knee for, and so I decided to make this work that was a kind of meditation on this relationship, this collision between these two powerful entities meeting up, and I mean, we can wax on and on about Ethiopia and Mussolini and the attack, but the general premise is that, he's a short, frail, but very powerful emperor. And then there's all these meditations about religion in the Caribbean and Rasta and Rastafarianism and who gets to decide what's a religion and what's not, and who decides what a God, how we define God and what a God is, and just this idea of play, being able to play with these bits of history, because I think that's kind of how the future happens, right? You ping pong moments of the present with the past, and then you end up with the future.
Yeah. I'm also interested in this other symbol of power, which we see indicated by the glacier and the explorer with the whip and the dogs. And I mean, I think after taking in the piece, that was the first thing that really kind of stuck out to me, was the size of the whip in that, or the whatever you make mush, and that speaks to some of your past work as well. And yeah, I wonder, how does exploration sort of fit into these pieces and your ongoing work? Yeah.
The great Matthew Henson, who discovered the North Pole in 1909, was an expert musher. He was an expert tent builder, fire maker. He fathered Inuit children, and then he was discredited for the most part for discovering the North Pole. And so much of my fascination and obsession is with people like Matthew Henson, because in the kind of the Parthenon of history and historic achievements, you could forget the guy that discovered the North Pole, or he could be pushed aside. When, in 1909, going to the top of the world was like, being on the moon or something. This is a very significant thing. So then why all of a sudden is the North Pole not seen understood as a fundamentally significant achievement? Especially when the guy that who made it there he looked just like me, right?
Yeah.
And so this is an ode to my meditations on the pole, but also being from an island, being from this place that's more or less, it could be invisible or at least understood in a very specific way, and ways in which I may not understand it, right? And so exploration was a way for me to see myself differently, to leave home, to kind of escape from home, to look on at home with some distance.
And have your thoughts about home sort of changed after the time away, like coming back, I guess? I think inevitably they do, because change is the only real reality out there. But I'm curious about how the distance, do you feel like it's made you more, what do you say, objective, able to look at things from a distance, or do you feel like it's actually made you more nostalgic?
Yeah, I think going back to the nostalgic piece, obviously just going back to that earlier piece of the conversation, nostalgia was something that militaries had great dread for, because the last thing you want is your troops longing to be home, and so they were treating this like a sickness. They were testing blood, and they were like, this was serious business. And then you fast forward to slavery, and you think about the longing for home. You disoriented again, and the slave condition wasn't necessarily treated as a medical condition, because slaves weren't necessarily human enough to have the ability or the capacity to have longing, right? You couldn't experience longing. And so this word nostalgia that is now tossed around is, for me, a very fantastic word that I embrace, right? Because it means that I'm reflecting the lost parts of my own history, right?
Yeah, I felt that. So these pieces are from your exhibit in plain sight at the Mary Goodman Gallery. Let's talk about these two works, No Name in the Street. I'm curious where the schematics come from. I know that in some of them they're basketball courts, they're hockey rinks, they're all these kinds of
I think they're just really. I think these plans are, to me, they're very beautiful plans, but I also I love the kind of poetry of game playing, and I love the way that game playing collides with creative practice, aesthetics, and storytelling. And I think there's this kind of idea in the neighborhood I grew up in, every kid, especially every boy child, believes they were gonna go pro at some sport as an aspiration. And I thought, like, no one wanted to be a dentist, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really fascinating. I think if you didn't grow up in a neighborhood like I grew up in, it's fascinating to have this superimposed limitation, right? That's based on your physicality and things like that. And so I love smashing these images together with images of science. And I'm not discrediting sports as not being scientific at all. I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's much to do with science. And so these are images of that's me during training and doing space training, kind of colliding with these images of expectation of little, brown and black kids. Like, this is where you're going to be when you grow up.
You mentioned in a conversation that we had that you were giving a talk to some younger kids, and you realized that they didn't believe that you had been, that you had done, that you had been to the places that you had been, that you had done the things that you had done. And I wonder if you could just remark on sort of, is that also an inherent reason why you continue to do this work? Yeah.
The last talk I did was at the last kind of stand-up, click-through slide talk that I did was at a university, and I stopped doing them because about 45 minutes after, the student population went crazy, and they decided that nothing I said was true. And I hadn't gone to the North Pole, and I didn't do space, and I just didn't do any of these things. And I think there's something confuddling about a kid who grew up who was born in a clapboard house, who was showing them images of of glaciers and space, and I think it's a challenging narrative for some folks. Anyway, so they were like very aggressively telling me how I am full of shit, and this went on for like an hour, and I think that I really enjoyed it, by the way, because I believe that we should all have a healthy amount of skepticism. I think this is what a good debate is. I think this is what good democracy is. I think you're allowed to be skeptical. But I wonder what would have happened if I wasn't who I was and I was showing those same images, right?
Yes. The inherent skepticism, the teacher black professor that has a degree who nobody calls doctor.
Yeah.
Yep. Feel you. Moving on. Yeah, this brings me to distant relatives, which I mean, these works were so arresting to me. The idea of you have these, for me, this was like this is where I kind of really begin to understand this idea of being an object of study versus being a body of knowledge. And these masks, which are collected and treated as these exotic pieces of display, but also are divorced from their cultural and religious ceremonial value, right? And then behind them, you have these plaster sculptures of these figures, these black figures from history and literature and science, and you can't actually see them from the front. I thought, wow, there's this juxtaposition that's happening, and I wonder, how are the masks for you functioning in these sculptures?
Yeah, every culture has a tradition of masquerade of some kind. And I think that idea morphs into this kind of existential mask that we're all wearing at some point or the other, right? There's all these meditations on the self, and there's W.E.B. Du Bois in there, there's Freud in there, there's I think for me the question always was, how do you expose a narrative that is not Columbus-centric for folks who live in the New World of color, right? How do you know that your story actually goes way, 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 way back? And how do you talk about it in a way that is not necessarily surrounding trauma? How do you frame that conversation on your own? And for me, this is one way to have that conversation without referencing the trauma piece. Because I think there's this thing about, specifically in America, there's this idea that like if your only way through is to negotiate trauma, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you have a dialogue about your own history without always having to heavily focus on trauma? I mean, the trauma obviously is important, and I think we need to deal with it. And I think we could have a whole other session here about trauma. But there are other things too, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so the mask for me is a way to try to reconnect pieces of history that are disconnected, or relatives, cousins, aunties, and uncles who are related to each other, but you just don't know that you are, right?
So the gaze, I think, shifts in terms of who's looking at the work, right? Whether I'm looking at the work, whether you're looking at the work, whether somebody who's not black is looking at the work.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think these particular sculptures are also a kind of monumentation that's actually happening, but it's happening outside of the show and the drama of our modern conversations around monumentation, who gets remembered, who doesn't get remembered, like let's take away these statues and let's erect other ones, but they're completely responsive, they're just replica, just change out the people and we're good. And I think which also troubles the notion of the concept of a hero and the concept of solitary achievement and all of these things. Sorry, a tangent, but this is a question for the audience. Does anybody know who that is? Does anybody know who that is?
Man in black gets white, isn't he?
Well, yes and no. You want to tell them?
Do you want to tell them?
It's Robert Smalls.
And who's Robert Smalls?
Well, he's actually the guy that the Notorious B.I.G. or Biggie Smalls got his name from, which is super fascinating. But he did so many things. Mm-hmm. But the long and short of it is he took over several slave ships, rescued a bunch of slaves, and then went on to become the first black congressman in America. And again, this is like, we should be talking about Robert Smalls.
Yeah.
I mean, for everyone. I mean, I think this is the thing.
Yeah.
We should all be talking about Robert Smalls.
Yeah. I didn't know Robert Smalls. I had to look him up. And then I looked him up, and I was like, well, the rage, actually, that first hits you when you realize, like, this man did what? He commandeered a slave ship, like, rescued all his folks, then trotted the slave ship, trotted the ship out into Confederate waters, went past them, and then sailed the ship into Union waters. And I'm like, yeah, this man is a G. Why don't I know who this person is, right? Like, why don't I know who this person is? And that, I think the feeling of actually recognizing how much we don't know, not just in a speculative sense about the future, but also about the past, and how what we don't know about the past then shapes the futures that are possible because of that lack of awareness. Yeah.
It's the $1,200 scholarship.
Like, what's possible? Like, does anybody know who this person is?
Well, that's going to be much harder.
Yes, I know, it is. I started off easy, but then and I'm going to... Do you want to share?
No, I think this is your turn.
Okay.
You're up.
This is Andrea Motley Crabtree, and she was the first woman to do naval deep sea diving. And this is an image, a sculpture of her. Yeah. And some of these figures, I loved the pairing of Robert Smalls and Andrea, because they both have these epic adventures with water and these extreme environments.
Yeah.
And I think about the realities in which, like, Black folks are often placed in extreme environments.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to, like, think about that as a concept necessarily. It's not divorced from our lived experiences, but their work and you then going into these places like space training and these kinds of experiments, is that just something because you had the desire to do that and you're just like, I'm gonna do that and that's possible, and I'm picking up the threads of where these folks left off? Or is there another reason why you have explored some of these extreme environments, like the poles and space and diving?
I think one of the more fascinating things I learned as a student is that all of the the classic Greek and Roman classics, all of the history, the material surrounding the Greek and Roman classics, we talked about this. It's just, it can fit on a bookshelf, right? The source material. It's not that much material to work from. I think that's remarkable, right? That so much of Western civilization is based off of a bookshelf's worth of material that then is just constantly studied and restudied and then studied again and re-regurgitated. And it feels so big, right? It feels so big if you think of all of the movements even in just visual culture, or specifically museum culture, art culture. You think about, modernism and impressionism, and you think about the Renaissance, and you think of all these kind of systems, and you think about those systems in relation to form, whether it's the introduction of paint, or whether it's photography, or you think of all these different systems. And I'm going to get home with you. Don't worry.
No, I'm
getting there.
following. I'm tracking.
And I think if you think of all these systems, you think of those systems in relation to inclusion or lack of inclusion, right? You think that there's a whole group of folks who were just left out of all those movements, right? It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
But the beauty of it is there's a boundlessness of ways in which you can access material and ideas and forms. And you can transcend time, and you can talk about the Renaissance again, right? Because you weren't really a part of that conversation. So how do you negotiate that? And I think that talking about extreme places and thinking about exploration and thinking about the rarity, right? Like these folks that I'm trying to talk about, they're great, right? And I think they should be celebrated, and I think they should be seen, and I think they should be talked about. And I think you can talk about them. The beauty of it, for me at least, is because there's been this exclusion piece, I can talk about them in any language that I want, right?
Yeah. You said in a conversation that the material is subservient to the narrative, and you're using, you can use any material to sort of talk about these great figures, and then sort of fill out the narrative because of that. And I loved that, because when you said the material is subservient to the narrative, as a poet, it really made me think of metaphor. It really made me think of this idea of the tenor and the vehicle. Like the vehicle can be whatever it needs to be in order to communicate this vast and varied message, but it actually needs multiple ways of communicating it, because it's maybe the first time that we are discussing it. It may be the first time, you said in another interview that, because time is not, in your view, linear, there could be something that was ignored 200 years ago that now might be the most significant thing that we can actually focus on, and your work is sort of pulling those narratives forward into the future and saying, maybe there's some importance here. Yeah.
Einstein said that too, though.
Oh, okay. Well, you just quoted Einstein.
Yeah. I think so. If you think about dubbing, so dubbing is a term that describes cutting music to create other music, right? So pre-existing music, and a lot of dubbing comes out of school systems in the early '60s and '70s, disallowing children of color to have access to instruments, and so reggae and hip hop and all this music comes out of dubbing, which is you found pre-existing sound, which is, it's what I do with the paintings, right? I find pre-existing, and I try to recreate with the material that's there. And I think what's profound about this experience that I'm describing to you, the experience of producing music under duress, more or less, right? Producing music when you're denied access to instruments, is that you create your own instruments, right? Which is the kind of the other side of the coin. And so if you don't have this denial of access, then you don't have this music. And the music is actually at the center of culture at the moment, right? And it has been for forever, right? This music is like the heartbeat of everyone. And so the thing that I think excites me is, what comes out of limitation. Not to erosize it, but like to think about how we're here, right? How did we get here, right? And when you see the hip hop artists on stage, you got to remember that 25 years ago they weren't seen as artists. They weren't allowed to be artists.
And in producing images, the sculptures like these, you're also asserting the right to be who people have always been, and to claim that fully, which is incredibly powerful and incredibly necessary in this moment.
5, 4.
Sorry, I want to talk briefly about Enoch before we transition to questions from the audience. But this piece, this sculpture, really, I thought, embodied a level of care and tenderness and concern that when I think about SpaceX and people blasting themselves up into space, I sort of am like, I'm totally uninterested in this project by these white men. And Enoch is a kind of living memorial to Robert Henry Lawrence Jr., the astronaut who was killed before he got to be able to go to space. And I guess I would ask, why was it important for you to do this project? And I'm sure you faced lots of limitations or people saying it's impossible, but I wanted to know what was the impetus for this project and how it how you conceptualized it and then actualized it.
Yeah. Well, the object itself is likened after a canopic jar. And the ancient Egyptians were thinking about space travel and time travel in the afterlife. And I thought it was an apt kind of vehicle for this story about this astronaut who was a physical chemist and didn't have this opportunity to go into space. Probably would have ended up on the moon. And I think that narrative would have been radically different, right? Would have changed the way we understand this moment that we're in. And so I memorialized him in this object in gold, a satellite, communication satellite. And there's a series of projects that will come from this satellite that's actively floating above us at the moment.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Lift off of the Falcon 9.
Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. was the first black astronaut in America who was a personal hero of mine and inspires me deeply. And he didn't get to go into space. He happened to die during a training exercise, doing a routine flight. Robert Lawrence is exceptional because he was an astronaut at a time when the tensions in America specifically was so much so that to think of a black man as an astronaut in 1966, 67 is quite fascinating.
I'm going to stop it there.
Yeah.
I just wanted to take a moment for people to sit and remember this man who many of us in this room may have never heard of. To take that moment and to consider what's possible in the cracks of knowledge that we don't often know to look for, and the processes and the people that are exploring, using, are kind of opening up our eyes to what's always present in front of us, And you are a person that is doing that work, and I've been so grateful to be in conversation
Thank you.
with you here tonight. So please, everyone, thank you. We have time for a few questions, so if you've got questions, just raise your hand. Yes?
Wait for the.
Thanks for a great conversation. Really wonderful. So I'm just curious about, sorry, I'm loud anyway, but here. Thanks for a great conversation. I'm curious about your process in terms of science. Your training, I work in art and science too as a theorist, really. Your training or how you've gained the knowledge of science, and if you've worked with scientists as part of your process?
Yeah, I think just through curiosity, really. I would like to have a more intelligible response, but it's just good old-fashioned curiosity. I think, it's at the heart of every artwork and every work of science that you see, any piece of architecture, et cetera, et cetera,
Could you share a little bit more about your experience with the college students who totally dismissed, discredited, discounted your experiences? It drew, and you, I don't know if these were the words, but you said something to the effect that you delighted in that moment. And when you were as you talked about that, it drew to mind some of what Isabel Wilkerson shares or explores rather in Cast. So could you say a little bit more about that?
I think a piece of it had to do with expectation, and so much of what I'm interested in is expectation. So like, how am I supposed to behave, right? So when someone sees me, how am I supposed to behave? What am I supposed to be curious about? Mm-hmm. What are the kind of pre-existing limitations that are being projected onto me? And I really love to think about it as play, because I think if you don't, then you lose sight of what is at stake if you get too serious about it. And so play is a really important piece to communication, I believe. And the students hadn't seen a body like mine in the places that they were in before. And so I think the systems of knowledge that people are bringing to the table are obviously problematic in ways in which they're completely unaware sometimes. And it's not always my responsibility to bring awareness to it, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because then I'm creating another series of problems. And so the delight that I described, I believe, had more to do with the fact that the reason why I continue to make is because I'm thinking about this dilemma. How do you bring something to someone's awareness without bringing something to someone's awareness, right? Because I think that moment of discovery is most profound when someone's not shouting it in your face, right?
Thank you.
I had a more fundamental artist type question. Obviously, you have very strong storytelling skills in your work, but being a sculptor and having studied that, being aware of tactile sense and wanting to touch things and wanting to manipulate them with your hands, but then putting something out in the water that's very far away, or even those masks, I'm sure the distance from the faces to the masks were very important. Can you just talk about physicality in storytelling?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Thank you for your question. I grew up not really feeling welcomed by the art world or art in general. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks who feel that way, like they don't belong, right? Hence the whole thing. So distance becomes, like illustrating distance becomes really important for me, because most of how I experienced a lot of the artists that I love was in books. at a distance. And so how do you talk about something? How do you enter a world in which you don't have physical access? And then storytelling and picture making and photography becomes really important vehicles for managing that limitation of being away from something, being far away. And I also think that, it doesn't always make sense to an audience member, depending on, what time frame they're being introduced to an artist. And I think the distance piece to me is, there's this thing about a finite game versus an infinite game. And there's this piece of philosophy that's about the difference between those two kinds of games. Like, one is a game that has winners and losers, and players that play to win or lose. And then an infinite game is a game that's, the players in that game play to play again, right? And I think I'm interested in playing to play again. And some of that has to do with the distance piece comes into focus, because I know that it isn't possible for you to understand everything that I'm trying to say in one work. But maybe next year you'll see something else, and maybe the year after that, maybe the year after that. That will help to inform the thing that you saw before. And it's a big basket to put all the eggs in, for sure. But again, I think this comes from a profound faith in the audience, right? If there's no trust between me and the people that I'm trying to communicate with, we're already lost. Yeah.
Thank you for this conversation. It's been so informative. I'm curious about what effect your neighborhood had on your aesthetics.
Yeah.
And when did you discover that? Was it immediate, or was it like, within the past couple of years? I'm really curious.
Yeah, that's a good question also. I think my neighborhood had all of the effect on me. I think I used to chase chickens a lot. And yeah, I was that kid. I was about 4 or 5, and you just run around from neighbor to neighbor chasing chickens, because what else to do, right? I think that aesthetics are essential to language, right? I mean, you could probably, I should have you answer this question, actually. No, but the images that I grew up with are really exciting to me. But they weren't exciting to me as a kid, right? Because I was taught to not value them. And so, as an adult, you have to really teach yourself how to revalue these things that the majority of society and culture is telling you not to value.
Yeah.
And I think for me, the work is cathartic in that way for me. It's an exercise in trust in self. But it's also a reevaluation of what is important to me, right? Or to us. And I think that it's really hard, right? To come to the realization that the images that you grew up with are not necessarily valued by everyone or more people. But again, the faith thing is hugely important, right? There's this kind of hope that over time, these narratives strung together will add up to something. But yeah, the aesthetics piece, the beads in the kitchen, right? The makeshift buildings, the quasi-science that's happening in the backyard. It's all there.
Hey, how you doing? Thank you for your talk. Can you scroll back to the work with the bus, please?
Yes, I can.
All right, cool.
Which,
You can go back to the other one.
Okay.
So I know we just talked about, you talked about the aesthetics from where you're from, and then this gentleman here talked about the relationship to the distance of the sculptures. But I'm just wondering, what was the decision to keep them? Those are plaster busts. What was the decision to keep them white?
I think there's a number of pieces to that. So to go, I'll come back. I'll go back to your question and come back to yours, if that's okay. So I grew up wearing masks as a kid in festivals in the Bahamas. So mask making is a huge part of the tradition, the cultural tradition there. And the only reason why I'm bringing that up again, or bringing it up now, is that it wasn't something that I thought was important, like at all, because I just wasn't taught that. I think that the aesthetic piece of the coloration for me has to do with the fact that there was this kind of play between the dynamism of the masks themselves and just the pure form of the heads and the faces and the reduction of the faces. So when you're looking at Mary Seacole, for example, for people who don't know who she was, should look her up. If you go back, can you go back to the image, the one closest to us? I wanted you to really have some opportunity to focus on the form, and then think of, this is a formal play of color and not color, really. So that's kind of how that unfolded. That's it?
that's it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for attending.